Hi, good morning. This is Theo Nasser from Right Hand. We're going to get started in just a few minutes here. We're going to let a few more people trickle in. Hi, good morning, everybody. This is Theo Nasser from Right Hand Cybersecurity. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. We're going to just let a few more people join us today. Good morning, everyone. Just hang on tight, please, for a few more minutes, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Probably about 2 more minutes here. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and then we'll go ahead and jump in. Welcome, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Theo Nasser, the CEO and co-founder of Right Hand Cybersecurity. I'm joined here today by Zamaan Qureshi from the Real Facebook Oversight Board. He's also a sophomore and international relations major at American University. I'm really excited about today's session with Zamaan because we're going to dive into a topic today. It's not just a really important topic, but it's also one that likely affects everybody here that's attending this call today, whether all of us realize it or not. And for our audience, if you have any questions today throughout our session, please add them into the Q&A window at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And what I'll do as the moderator, I will do my best to work those into today's discussion. Today's webinar is also going to be recorded and made available on our website as well. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to just start by introducing Zamaan. Zamaan, welcome.
Hi, Theo. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining us today. Maybe before we dive in, I know the hot topic of what we're going to be discussing today, Zamaan, is in regards to your curiosity and your investigation and your findings of when you looked in to find out what exactly Facebook was tracking with your personal data. But before we dive into that today, I just want to start with an introduction. Can you tell our audience here today a little bit about yourself, and also just a little bit about the Real Facebook Oversight Board, what it represents and what its mission is?
Sure. So my name is Zamaan Qureshi. I am from the suburbs of Chicago. As Theo said, I'm currently a sophomore studying international relations and political science at American University. I work in policy and social media for the Real Facebook Oversight Board, which is a watchdog organization aimed at holding Facebook accountable and providing oversight for the company-funded Facebook Oversight Board. We were formed in September of last year, so just coming up to over exactly a year ago. And we were founded in the wake of the 2020 election to try and hold Facebook accountable. We had real concerns about what the company was going to essentially be a part of in this important democratic process in the 2020 election. And the Real Facebook Oversight Board is a group of researchers, journalists, tech experts, and social media critics who have been long concerned about Facebook's role in democracy and other issues, and formed really out of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Our founders included Carol Cadwalader from The Guardian, Roger McNamee, Maria Ressa, Damian Collins, and these individuals got together and said, we need to do something. And so that's how the Real Facebook Oversight Board formed. Since our formation, we've been involved in a wide range of different activations and projects to try and hold Facebook accountable. The one that I work on chiefly is working with congressional representatives and staffers to prep them on the right questions to ask social media, or to ask Facebook executives when they testify before Congress, and also getting an idea of what the next best policy initiatives are to help regulate these companies.
So it sounds to me like the big takeaway here of what you and this group does, Zamaan, is it's all around helping hold Facebook accountable. Is that a fair assessment of what the real Facebook Oversight Board is about and what your mission is?
Yeah, we view ourselves chiefly as Facebook's chief antagonist, I guess you could say. We are constantly viewing their work in the public domain and trying to advocate on behalf of what we see are global citizens who are concerned about Facebook's role in democracies, not just in the United States. And we want to give those individuals a voice as well by making sure that we can advocate, for example, for their control of their user information and data.
So you represent and advocate for, I was just doing some research here yesterday, a little bit about Facebook and the Oversight Board. Almost 3 billion people then on the globe is who you aim to represent and provide a voice to. There's roughly 3 billion, approaching 3 billion Facebook users on Earth.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, what we want to do here, Zamaan, and I'm very familiar with your story, but I'm not sure how familiar our audience is. Before we dive into the details, for our audience here today, Zamaan is going to be sharing his screen and actually walking us through bit by bit, detail by detail, exactly what Facebook was tracking of his own personal data. He's going to be walking us through what he was able to detect that Facebook was tracking after he had even deleted the app from his phone. He's going to be walking us through the steps that each of us can take, our audience here today, and anyone who chooses to watch today's webinar recording later. He's going to be walking us through the steps that we can all take to adjust our Facebook configurations to limit some of this monitoring or governance that Facebook is providing of all of our data as well. So that's what I mean when I say we're going to dive into the nitty-gritty details. Zamaan's going to be walking us through all of that. Now, but Zamaan, before you dive in and actually share your screen, several months back, you drew a lot of attention. And I guess in the wake of our social media conversation, you went viral in regards to what you had discovered about the data that was being monitored and captured by Facebook of yours. Can you just provide us a quick overview and summary of what you were able to detect and identify?
Sure. So my interest around my Facebook data came about actually because of a data breach that occurred to Facebook, specifically a few years prior to this year. Facebook had been involved in a data breach of about 530 million users, and all of those personal data points, which included names, email addresses, phone numbers, addresses, employment information, and the unique Facebook user ID. Those were all breached on the internet and available to anyone that this hacker, this rogue actor essentially made available to anyone for a price. Working for the real Facebook Oversight Board, we were deeply concerned with this data breach. And we were already in discussions with the Irish Data Protection Commission to try and make sure that they were held accountable, that Facebook was held accountable by the Irish CPC for this data breach. So this occurred during the week, and then around the weekend, I started to wonder if I was included in the breach. So there was a third-party website which was set up called Have I Been Pawned? I went to this website, put in my information, and found that my personal information had been included in this data breach, and along with 530 other million users. And so I decided to dig a bit deeper. I was curious about what kind of data points they really had on me. Obviously, the data that was breached is pretty surface level information, but I was curious what lay under the surface. So I was Googling around on the tools that Facebook has available. I remember from the 2018 congressional hearing, Mark Zuckerberg said that there's a tool where you can download your Facebook data. And so I went and I found this tool. I downloaded my Facebook information and I clicked and opened every single folder. One folder that concerned me was this folder called Your Off Facebook Activity. And in Your Off Facebook Activity, I found a couple thousand files of HTML links that takes the user to specific dates and points in which Facebook viewed what you were doing off the Facebook platform. So this is, for example, when you're browsing on the web, when you open an app on your phone that's separate from Facebook. I've had it described to me since then as embedded SDKs, which transmit this information to Facebook, and they get that because Facebook have embedded tools or ads around the internet which allow them to do this.
So framing this to an everyday Facebook user, let's just say a teenager. A teenager uses Facebook, and the information that the teenager shares on Facebook is going to be their name. It might be their birthday. It might be the school they go to. Like you said, some basic level information that someone can find on a LinkedIn profile. They can find it on probably any social media platform in today's day and age. But what you're saying is that it was taken a layer deeper, where if that individual, that teenager, took an Uber from point A to point B, that was being tracked by Facebook. If that individual had an application on their phone to have Domino's pizza delivered to their house for dinner, that activity was being something completely outside of the Facebook app, not completely unrelated to what Facebook does as a core competency. That information was being monitored in Facebook as well. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I want to be careful here because Facebook, in a Newsweek article, which I was interviewed for, said specifically that these two things were not conflated. And I want to be sure because they are right about that. The Facebook data breach that occurred is separate from your off Facebook activity. And the only reason that I went there was to see what information possibly the company was collecting on me. And for example, what might be vulnerable or susceptible to a breach. Not saying that this information was leaked on the internet. I published this information myself and put it out there. Any user who uses Facebook can go and look for this information themselves. But I still think it's an important data point to look at and say, wow, like this company is collecting this much information on me. As you said, you know, activating the Uber app, activating the Domino's pizza app, all triggered a response or a file that was created for Facebook. And this all goes into how they are able to target ads towards you and form kind of almost a social profile of who you are and target the best kind of content that they think you will react most to or engage with the most.
But I think it even goes a layer deeper, though. It's so important to talk about this in the context of the data breach, Zamaan, because that basic information that was released, that's a set of data that was breached and now publicly available to criminals on the dark web and potentially anyone if they're able to find and locate that data. But when you bring these two different things together, right? The data that Facebook is tracking and then now the security incident that Facebook experienced, if Facebook is tracking more data about you or about any of us, and there's a security incident in where the criminal is able to access that bucket of data, now the information about you that's being released, it's not so basic anymore. Now people can have access into where you're traveling, what you're eating, who you're interacting with, where you're located. There's a whole new treasure trove of information that's now included in what I think you're about to show us today with what Facebook is tracking for the purpose, as you described, which is mainly around creating this social profile. To me, this sounds like profiling by definition, being able to collect as much about an individual as possible to then tailor, whether it's ads or any type of marketing exercise and experience to an individual.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is probably a good time for me to share my screen and
Let's jump in. Go ahead.
walk us through this. So, so this is the file. This is the file that generated for me. It's Facebook and then dash your unique user ID. And I've since changed that to my name because that is a personally identifiable data point in which in which any individual can actually link your personal information to your Facebook user ID is actually a very powerful thing to do. Basically, Facebook allowed me to download this file. It gave me a whole range of folders on a whole range of different things, most of which we won't touch on today. A lot of it is information that you'd expect them to collect in order to run their program or to run their platform, as they would say. Not all of this is specifically, devious or scary in any way, but it does give you an idea of just how many data points Facebook are collecting on you. So specifically in the ads and business folder, you will find a folder called your off Facebook activity. And this is where it shocked me, like just the number of data points that have been collected on me. And I haven't even had a chance to go through all of these because there are so many. And I will point to specific ones in a moment. But each of these HTML files generates a link that shows you exactly what date and time you accessed a certain website or an application on your phone. So I pulled out a few in this folder here that show you. So DoorDash, for example, is another one that many teenagers or just the average user might be using. So this is the kind of file that will pull up on your browser, and it would show when the app was activated, at what specific time, and how many times it did this. And I want to be clear, I did not log into DoorDash with my Facebook account. There is no connection that I made between my DoorDash account and my Facebook account. What's happening is happening behind the scenes, and most users are probably unaware that this is happening at all. So DoorDash and Facebook is collecting this information when I have activated the DoorDash app. Another one, for example, is Uber, as you spoke on. Again, shows when the app was activated and at what specific times. One that I found quite concerning, and I think many others might find concerning as well, is I was doing a research project over last summer on immigration, and the Customs and Border Protection, the United States Customs and Border Protection website was one website which I visited, and Facebook collected that information when I visited cbp.gov. This is quite surprising to me. I'm not really sure why Facebook would want to know which users are visiting cbp.com. It's quite surprising that was in there. Kind of one was that jumped out at me. And then another point that wasn't specifically included in your off Facebook activity was messages. So what I did was the night before a previous interview, I downloaded my Facebook activity. I'd sent a message on Facebook Messenger to someone. And then immediately after, I downloaded my off Facebook activity, or my Facebook activity, my Facebook data, to see what was there. And it generated the message almost instantaneously in the download. And so, you might think that, oh, well, Facebook is collecting this information because it needs it to run its platform. This is a message I sent to someone. But if you think about it, most people probably think about their messages as between the receiver and the sender, and that's it. Unless it's a group chat or something, then that would be, maybe multiple people in that group. But I don't think we think about the company itself or the platform reading our messages. And I'm not suggesting that someone is necessarily sitting at Facebook reading through my messages, but having AI and systems that can be built, which can look at what's in messages and find ways to, as we said, create social profiling or target ads, it's that kind of idea. It's that kind of a surveillance-based advertising.
Wow. So what we're looking at, what we just looked at, Zamaan, are the elements of your profile. And when I say your profile, this is your phone profile. These are the applications that you use, the activities that you, I think I saw DoorDash, right? I think you had some food delivery. I saw Uber.
Yep. Yep.
Messages, TikTok, other social media channels that are
Yeah.
not Facebook. In fact, probably a direct competitor of Facebook, demanding attention to a completely different application. All of that was being tracked while you were offline of Facebook, not using the application. Did you have the Facebook app downloaded on your phone?
So yeah, this is actually interesting because I deleted the Facebook app. I think it would be around February of 2020. And when I downloaded my Facebook activity in April of 2021. Actually, sorry, I deleted the app in February of 2021, and I downloaded my Facebook data in April of 2021. And what I found was that it was still showing activated apps on my phone after I had deleted the Facebook app. So I'm an Instagram user. And so my thought process was that that was the app that was being collected. But just think about, from an average user perspective, how many times you have to think about which apps you have downloaded and where the data is being collected from. It's such a convoluted network that most people would have no idea that this kind of data collection is even happening on them. And it's quite scary to think about that, even if you delete the app, they can still find that data or acquire that data in some other way. Obviously, the Facebook suite of apps, Messenger, WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, are some of the highest most downloaded apps on the Apple App Store every single quarter. So people are finding ways, or are always going to be plugging into Facebook in some way. And as I've talked about previously, it's really challenging to be an active part of society, let alone a student or be an employee at a job without being on social media. So these platforms are in a way necessary for social connection, but there's a whole underlayer of data collection and sharing that is going on that most users have no idea is happening.
Well, that's their competitive advantage, right? We rely on these platforms for life, personal life, professional life, social life, everything. For this webinar, my company used social media. We use LinkedIn, but we use social media to market and advertise this webinar, to have this conversation today, to attract our audience. That's one of our main avenues of bringing people here today to hear your story. So when you kind of look at, well, what's the alternative, I think is like one of the big questions, right? Is, this is obviously a wake-up call, and I know we're going to kind of get into some guardrails that we can implement. We're going to get to that in a bit here, about guardrails and configurations and steps we can actually take to limit what you've just showed us for our audience. But before we get there, it's like, if I think of this from multiple different lenses, and our audience can do the same, and please shoot me a message or a question here if you've got another way we can think about this together. But when you think of this as a business owner, when you think of this as a father, when I think of this as someone who wants to keep in touch with old friends who I don't see in different continents around the world in different time zones, I rely on a lot of these different channels. I'm not an avid or an active Facebook user, but of course, for years I have been. What is my alternative, really? Because that's where the majority of people are. I think that's a bit of a conundrum that a lot of people face. It's like, do you go cold turkey and turn it off and never look back? But there's a cost to that.
Yeah, so I had the privilege this week of writing an op-ed for Time Magazine in the wake of the Wall Street Journal's reporting last week on the Facebook files, in which journalists from the Wall Street Journal got a hold of and spoke to uh, a Facebook whistleblower. And the whistleblower, sorry, excuse me, the whistleblower basically shared with them a trove of information and documents which showed internal Facebook findings around the harms of Instagram, for example, on the mental health of teenagers. And so one thing that we document in the op-ed that myself and a senior at Oklahoma State University, Destiny Adams, we wrote about specifically that issue, that there is a social price to leaving these platforms, especially as young people. And so it's really challenging, as you said, to go cold turkey and cut all your involvement on social media platforms, all your engagement on social media platforms. So with that in mind, and with the fact that, with the idea in mind that there really isn't an alternative, you can't go from Facebook to another platform that will give you the exact same services and the exact same social network, because everyone is so embedded into Facebook. We need regulatory help or some kind of safeguards in place that allow us to be protected when we use social media platforms.
So that kind of takes us to I guess the next step of this conversation is what is next, right? There are implications and a social price, as you described it, to leaving these platforms. So we're all in some degree compelled to stay, and I'm just talking about social media now in general, right? People might know. I've got a hunch here that a lot of the people that joined us today, and just a lot of Facebook users in general, they might have a hunch. They might feel as though, I'm trying to put myself in the mind of just the everyday Facebook user, not necessarily someone like you or I who live this data privacy, cybersecurity, digital lifestyle every single day, Zamaan. But if we kind of think of this as the everyday user, they might have a hunch that, wow, I'm really sharing a lot on social media, right? I'm posting these pictures, I'm adding my data. They seem to know a lot about me, but I don't think most people know how deep this actually goes with what you described. I really don't think most people truly grasp that. And that in itself is a bit of a problem. I mean, people need to at least have information in front of them to be able to make the conscious decision, at least, right? You can make the conscious decision of, I know Facebook is collecting this from me. I know it's being tracked in my off Facebook activity, right? When I'm not using the app. But I don't think people know that. How can people know that? You talked about regulation. What's right and cybersecurity's webinar here. We're only going to have so much reach. I know you've been on a lot of other social channels and a lot of other podcasts and interviews, Zamaan, and I hope that the reach is vast. But of course, we're not reaching 3 billion users. How do we expand this?
So Facebook will hide behind their terms of service, their terms and conditions, the user agreement, that when you sign up for Facebook, you essentially are waiving your rights. You're signing a legal document which says that you agree that when you use this platform, Facebook can do all these things. And one United States senator who is a lawyer told Mark Zuckerberg that, even as a lawyer, reading the terms of service of your platform, he doesn't understand them. So how can we expect that the average Facebook user is going to understand them? So one of the regulatory fixes or practices in place that is at least being recommended and talked about right now is finding a way for us to deliver terms and conditions, terms of service to users in a more understandable way, so that users can look at the terms and conditions, understand what is happening, and adequately give consent to be on the platform or not be on the platform. right now you don't really have a lot of options. You either click yes and you're on Facebook, or you click no and you're not on Facebook. So with that in mind, that to me is the only real reach and ability to access, the almost 3 billion users and let them know what's really happening.
We're all guilty of this, Zamaan, right? Like, how many software applications or social media channels or different different, whether it's for work or personal, different applications that we access where it says, here are your terms and conditions, click on continue to accept, right? And then you have the choice if you want to read through this really dense documentation. So we're all a bit at fault of that. But at the same time, I agree, when it gets this murky and when it goes this deep, it just feels as though there should be a little bit more awareness for the everyday user, exactly what they're signing up for. And before we started this webinar, Zamaan, we were talking a little bit about the international policy. I know you said that people have to opt into Facebook, right? You have to opt in, you have to sign up. But if we talk a little bit about the international posture and presence, in some countries, I know it's not like this in the United States, but in some countries around the world, the barrier to entry is a bit different. Could you maybe describe what's currently happening? I know we had just talked about this with one of my colleagues who has shared about the policy in Brazil, right? When you purchase a new phone, your application, the phone already has Facebook downloaded as an application.
Yep.
When you purchase a phone, you buy a phone with Facebook installed, which is interesting.
Yes.
That's not something that we're used to or have exposed here in the US. Can you talk a little bit about just kind of the international stance on this?
Yeah, so Facebook in Myanmar, for example, which, by the way, some of the listeners on this webinar might remember that Facebook was judged by the United Nations to have facilitated what amounted to a genocide in Myanmar. So in Myanmar, Facebook comes pre-downloaded on phones. And so when people speak about the internet, when they refer to the internet in Myanmar, they're referring to Facebook. And Facebook is, when it's viewed as the internet in some countries, that means that posts and information that come on Facebook, which we know is full of misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, that have really spread within the past few years. People view those as facts. And without getting into a whole nother discussion about content moderation, the focus of Facebook being the internet in some countries is really dangerous to people's perception of getting verified, quality, factual information. So for example, the COVID vaccine, making sure that people get vaccinated is a real challenge if people are reading posts that say that, spread conspiracy theories about the COVID vaccine or other treatments. And people read those as facts because they're reading it on the so-called internet. And so, that's one international kind of look at what Facebook is away from the United States. But I think the business model around the world is still the same. The business model being, Facebook's business model is to monetize user information and to maximize profit over privacy. They don't have an incentive to change their business model because it is making them money right now. And as long as it continues to make them money and their shares continue to rise, there is no incentive, unless there's a regulatory pressure to do so, to change. So that's why I say this, that the onus cannot be on Facebook and the companies to make these changes. They are digital giants right now, in terms of how much these companies are worth, how much their executives make right now. They have no incentive to change anything they're doing unless we as a public are pressuring our lawmakers to make changes, and our lawmakers are listening to us and finding regulatory fixes and building a framework in place that, for example, gives users a control over their data, that takes on these companies from an antitrust perspective and looks at the anti-competitive nature of some of these companies, that looks at specifically how user information and data has been used. So yesterday, for example, a Facebook executive testified for a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee specifically on privacy and big data. And one thing that this executive said was that Facebook is a free platform. So most of us think of Facebook as a free platform in that we don't have to pay to be on the platform. But Senator Mike Lee, a Republican from Utah, said to the executive that, aren't we paying with our data? Aren't we paying by being on the platform, with the data that we give to Facebook? Because Facebook then take that data and monetize it and make a profit off of the information that we are giving to the company. So if you think about it from that perspective, it changes the outlook on what you think about your activity on Facebook. Every minute, every second, every engagement that you make on that platform is a money-making factor for the company that they can take and turn into profit. So with that framework in mind and what we've previously talked about, I think people who are on this webinar, and hopefully more generally, can slowly start to change their perception of what their experience is like on social media. Because what it is at face value is not what is happening behind the scenes.
Let's dive in further into this regulation side. We've actually gotten some questions from our audience on this, and we've also gotten some requests from our audience around having you walk through the step-by-step process of what we can do to change our Facebook configurations, which we will surely get to here in a moment. But first, on the regulation side, you talked a little bit about policy having to start at the top, and it has to start with government. We can't just rely on these Goliath organizations, right? These behemoth tech giants to implement change when, from a revenue perspective, they're just doing so well. There was an article, I think this week, in the Wall Street Journal, Zamaan, and they talked a little bit about, they just asked this question and started to investigate a bit. Is Facebook doing enough to protect its users, right? It's not a regulatory change, but it seems to be getting some attention this week. Can you speak a little bit to that Facebook article in the Wall Street Journal? And then I think Facebook even came back with a formal response to that.
Yeah, so the Wall Street Journal series was actually a series of articles published last week, one every single day, which took a look at these Facebook files. And the Wall Street Journal spoke to a whistleblower about this kind of information. And as you said, one of the things that one of the articles pointed out was, is Facebook doing enough to protect its users? And so there was an article about how Facebook has been a platform in which drug cartels can organize, how human traffickers can move people around the world and get access to job postings for people in vulnerable positions so they can be trafficked. And then it spoke specifically to my generation as well, users on Instagram, for example. I saw that that comment down below specifically about Instagram. The research that the Wall Street Journal laid out on Instagram was that Facebook, or Instagram specifically, Facebook found internal research that they conducted that found that Instagram was specifically detrimental to the health of teenagers. And this wasn't talking about, an industry-wide problem or social media specifically, or, across the big tech platforms. It specifically focused on Instagram, the platform, as being detrimental to the mental health of teenagers, and in some cases, leading to diagnoses of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and at times suicidal ideations. And so with that in mind, the Facebook files that the Wall Street Journal worked on were really a look behind the door of what Facebook knows and simply just isn't sharing with the public. Senators Blumenthal and Blackburn asked Mark Zuckerberg a few months ago for this research, and Facebook essentially came back to them and said, well, we don't really do this research, or we're not comfortable sharing the findings of this research. Well, there's kind of no surprise why they weren't interested in sharing that if it was this bad. And looking at it now, it really is bad. I mean, to look at that and to try and spin it as Nick Clegg, the VP of Facebook, has tried to do this week, as oh, this is research that we are simply working on, and we're proud of this research. I don't think Facebook are taking enough action fast enough to protect its users, and specifically its younger users. We know from the acquisition of Instagram a few years back by Facebook that Facebook were concerned about how it was going to access younger markets. And so they specifically bought Instagram with the idea in mind that they were going to be able to access a whole range of new audiences of young people. And so now they have acquired Instagram. They've been, Instagram has been a full-fledged part of the Facebook suite for years now. It is, again, a money-making machine for the company. And so when we talk about Instagram as simply a platform, I think we also have to keep in mind that Instagram is specifically a platform for the company to drive in newer and younger users. Some people might be aware of a proposal inside Facebook to create Instagram for kids. I mean, what a terrible idea right now in the wake of this new research from the Wall Street Journal. I mean, Facebook should be going nowhere near creating platforms for people under the age or up to the age of 13, for example. That is really scary to think that they are kind of entering this space so they can continue to access younger and younger audiences just to make more money.
And then again, when we link this back to the privacy conversation as well, I mean, I think what you're touching on is a bit of like a moral and ethical conversation too. But when we also talk about privacy of data, now we're not just talking about the privacy of data of you and I, Zamaan, who are, very much have the wherewithal to make these conscious decisions of what we want to allow them to see. Now you're looking at a whole new demographic of users that frankly just don't have that wherewithal to, understand the impact of some of these decisions. And what they'll have, Facebook now has this data of what you had shared with us at the beginning of this webinar. And then we all know that once that data is there, it's how it's used and what's done with it. Really, the options are endless. So
yeah, exactly.
So just kind of looking to the next step here, Zamaan, I think we want to start talking about, well, what steps can we take as Facebook users to limit this, whether we are teaching this, and again, I'm wearing multiple hats here because I'm thinking of that of our audience. I'm trying to think that of our listeners and people who might be interested. How do we take action here as business professionals? How do we take action here as parents? How do we take action here as teachers? How do we take action here as people who might be in a place of being able to influence or educate others who potentially are Facebook users? Would you mind walking us through that by sharing your screen, please?
Yes. So I'm going to do my best to hide my personal information. Basically, this is my Facebook account. So you're currently looking inside my Facebook settings. Also, some users might be asking themselves, Zamaan, you already know all of this information. Why haven't you deleted your Facebook account? As Theo and I kind of talked about, it's really hard to be a functioning member of society without accessing these platforms. So there are various clubs and university programmings at my university that require us to be on Facebook. And that's why I still have my account today. But basically, to access your user information, you want to go to download your information. So you can do exactly what I did in my viral thread, and you can go in and download your information. You can request a copy and it will be sent to your email. and you have access to all of these different data points in which they will give you information on, one of which being your off Facebook activity. So I have disabled my the tracking of your off Facebook activity, because you can do that. As you see here, it says off Facebook activity, and you can click view. And you will see that your off Facebook activity is currently turned off. I can manage my history by clicking here and logging in, and it will take me to this page where it says, this is a summary of the apps and websites that have been connected to your Facebook account, and then you can, manage your future off Facebook activity. And then this is the button that I checked, which turns off your Facebook activity. Now, when I click this button, there was a little pop-up when I clicked this button a few months back when I downloaded my information. It was like, wow, what the heck? When I turned off this button, there was a little pop-up that in the kind of fine print below that Facebook said, and it says it right here, it says your experience may be less personalized, and the ads you may see or may be less relevant to you. And so to me, this kind of read as almost guilting you into clicking this button. It was almost as if to say that if you click this button, your Facebook experience would be lessened. And so I want to make clear to everyone who's watching today and anyone who might watch in the future, I would highly encourage you to turn off your off Facebook activity. My experience has been better as a user because I have the peace of mind that Facebook isn't at least publicly or at least saying, to me specifically, that we are collecting that information. Personally, I think they're still collecting that information. They just don't share it with me as much. Or maybe they're collecting a little less of it, but in order to do their ad targeting and continue to be as an effective money-making model as they can be, they're going to want to collect as much information on you as possible. But I hope this has been a good explainer for users to go in their own Facebook accounts and deactivate this future off Facebook activity.
Thank you, Zamaan. A few minutes ago, I launched a poll and we just closed the poll, but the question for the audience was, what is your biggest fear in exposing personal data to social network giants? 50% responded by saying they just feel as though they have no visibility how it's used. 50%.
Yeah.
So what that tells us, Zamaan, I think we had this hunch at the beginning of the call, and now we've got a bit bigger of a sample size here. It's just, we just don't know where this ends. We don't know what it's being used for. Yes, we click the button and maybe we spin this upon ourselves with the terms of service, right? When we log into Facebook, I don't think any of us even remember probably when we had interacted with the terms of service on Facebook when we first signed into the platform for the first time years and years ago. But surely I don't ever remember consciously signing up for sharing where I'm traveling on my Uber rides. I surely don't ever remember signing my name up to letting people know what kind of food I'm ordering or where I'm going, right? That to me just feels like a little bit more of an invasion of privacy in many regards. So very, very interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just going to add on to that and say, from a young people's perspective, I know as you shared that poll, it reminded me of some conversations I've had with my peers, both in university, back home in Chicago. And I've had it described to me, heard it described as a psychological phenomenon known as learned helplessness. It's the idea that, these kinds of systems, this data collection, it's all happening, but there's almost a numbness or a response from some people, at least my age, to what's going on, as if to say, these platforms are doing all of this and I can't do anything about it. And that's a real response that I think a lot of people have, is like, this is such a big thing to take on. I mean, people have jobs, they've got families, they've got food they need to, cook and feed their families. They need to go to work. They need to do other things that isn't sitting down and thinking about how their Facebook activity is being used. And so I think a lot of people just kind of sit with that and decide to not think about it because it's such a big thing to take on in your mind about, well, how am I going to prevent these companies from tracking my information? So I hope I've given, one step in which people can take, but the bigger problem is that, Facebook probably want us to think like that, to want us to have this kind of numb response to the regulatory and discussion that's going on right now, because it is a big conceptual thing to take on, to talk about, big data and how that's being used for ad targeting. It's daunting when you start to think about it.
Absolutely. You said that you shared a step to help users really reconfigure their Facebook privacy settings. I think you hopefully everyone looks at today as a big step in helping them accomplish that, Zamaan. So thank you so much for your time today and walking us through that. When I first read and saw your findings and heard about your investigation and heard about the story, now I watched your interview with Steve Morgan. I just felt compelled in any way that we could as a company at Right Hand to help you amplify this message, because I think it's really powerful just to give people the wherewithal and the ability to at least make the conscious decision. The people here today can at least make the conscious decision about how they want to configure their Facebook data privacy configurations. And whether we choose to or not, at least we're educated and able to make that decision ourselves. But I still have this feeling, I have this hunch. I don't know if I'm alone here, even though we've been able to uncover a lot of really important things. And I know the conversations are still happening in Congress, and they're still happening with regulations. We've obviously seen the announcement in the last few years of CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. I still just feel that this is just the tip of the iceberg as it pertains to these tech giants and data privacy and what we can do as users to really gain back control and protect ourselves online. We looked at it a lot of different angles today as it pertains to privacy, as it pertains to security incidents. And then you provided some really interesting perspective about how this actually impacts ethics and morals as well, for the greater good of the younger generations. So Zamaan, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. Everyone, Zamaan is a sophomore at American University. Obviously, a very intelligent student, a very intelligent individual with a very bright future ahead, Zamaan. So we're all very much interested in following your journey and what you continue to uncover. I think you represent a lot of students who probably have this curiosity, but to see you take the next step to actually investigate and act on it is extremely refreshing and extremely important for the future. So keep up the fantastic work. I'll surely be following you.
Thank you, Theo. Thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. And to our audience today, thank you so much for being with us. We hope you're empowered by some of this information today from Zamaan. And we hope that after today closes, you take the necessary steps to secure your data on Facebook. We have recorded this session. We will be posting it. So stay tuned. And you'll be able to download that from our Right Hand website. I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Take care, and thank you for joining us. All the best.